Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m. Wednesday, 4 of Regional Rap. Regional and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, No New State for You, is my guest, Dr. Jacob Deem, Assistant Professor at Bond University's Faculty of Law. Jacob's research focuses on constitutional law, federalism, and public trust. In his recent book, Rethinking Decentralization, he examines how citizens' attitudes and political culture has contributed to the successful federalism of 8 countries, including Australia, and explores reform options to strengthen the federal structure. Jacob was the project leader on the 2021 Australian Constitutional Values Survey and is now working on the Australian Research Council funded project, researching public trust, distrust and mistrust. He has also worked on several research projects on the use of technology in improving access to legal services for regional Australians and culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Jacob is also the author of an opinion piece, Secession is No Solution for the North Queensland's Future, which was published as a letter to the editor column in the Townsville Bulletin on the 29th of August. In response to Senator Canavan's opinion piece, we need to create a new state to rescue the country, which was published in the Courier Mail on the 23rd of August. Welcome, Jacob.
Good evening, Bill. Great to join you.
You should give us a bit of background about yourself. I mean, you're still a young man compared to me, but could you give us a bit of background on your childhood and how you sort of come into the field that you're currently in at the moment?
Yeah, I can do that. So currently, as you mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Bond University down on the Gold Coast. Prior to that, I was a lecturer at CQ University's School of Business and Law for about 5 years. And then prior to that, I was at Griffith Uni, so very much in the academic space. But broadly, I've always been really interested in ideas of, I suppose, power and who gets to make decisions and on whose behalf. And as I looked more and more closely at those issues, something that really fascinated me were these fundamental principles of federalism and looking at, in what ways are we similar, in what ways are we different, and how can we use legal and political structures to capture and celebrate those differences and make sure that government decision making, wherever possible, acknowledges and provides for that difference, while also harnessing the strengths of a broader nation.
You're telling me before we went on air that you come from Maryborough area. Did you sort of start thinking of where the direction you were going when you were at high school, or did it just come when you got to university?
I think the ideas of what are we doing as a society and how do we want to structure the systems that are governing it was definitely more of an at university thing. But I think like anyone, your early upbringing has an influence to some degree.
And did your parents point you in any particular direction in regards to what you got to?
No, they were pretty happy for me to find my own path.
So the survey work you've taken on in regards to the Constitution and things like that, can you give us a bit of information in regards to how that group was formed and what its role was and what its output was?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Australian Constitutional Values Survey started in 2008. It was founded by Professor AJ Brown at Griffith University, who I believe has also been on your podcast.
Yeah, he's been on the show.
And so the surveys they've run, I came on board in 2012, 2014. So they've been run roughly every 2 years since 2008. And the aim is to each time get a nationally representative sample of Australians. We oversample for regional areas a bit more heavily just to make sure that we're capturing some regional nuances as well. But over that time, we've looked at a lot of different constitutional and political issues to try and gauge attitudes towards, for example, recognition of local government in the Constitution, as all the voice debates really heated up, looking at recognition of First Nations people in the Constitution. But one of the enduring themes throughout has been these ideas of federal political culture, or the extent to which Australians have shared attitudes and beliefs that might maintain a federal system of government, broadly having 2 or 3 tiers of government, depending if you want to count local government or not.
No.
And then, I count it, but constitutionally not. And then, looking at the way that people's beliefs about government might prop up that system or support that system, or sometimes in the academic literature, there's question marks about whether Australians really care enough about federalism for that system of government to be viable here. So that's an enduring thing that we've really been interested in over, what is it now, over 10, 15 years.
I think the biggest danger for Australians is they're so apathetic about everything in regards to, until something hits their hip pocket or that, and especially politics, they don't even want to engage in it until some situation, directly affects them. So that's the problem. In regards to the survey, and it's quite common with a lot of politicians, they get frustrated with either the Senate or something like that, and they have issues with the Constitution, and it beggars belief. I would say less than 10% of our politicians have even bothered looking at the Constitution or know about the separation of powers and that. So within these studies, are there sort of things in regards to frustration with the current Constitution we got, or do people consider that's the one we got? We should sort of accept that our forefathers drafted it in a period when they fought, were trying to get 6 separate colonies. If they hadn't had separate federation, it would move towards federation. We'd have 6 different countries in Australia at least. That was the option if they didn't go into a federation. So, is there in these surveys and just within the constitutional law frustration with the current constitution, or accepting it and fact that, well, it's what we've got to live with it unless we're going to take action to amend it here and there as we go?
Yeah, I don't know that we've ever worded the questions in a way that would let us say that people are frustrated with the current model. But in 2010, we presented people with 4 different constitutional issues that sort of seem to need solving. So republic, recognition of local government, recognition of First Nations peoples, and rethinking about the allocation of responsibilities within the Federation. And for each of those 4 issues, we said, how important do you think it is to have a referendum on this issue or to change the Constitution to address this? So it wasn't a yes, no, but how important do you think we address this would be? And it was less than 5% of people said no to all 4. So, it's easy to say, yes, it's important. It's another thing to actually vote in a referendum, as you would know. We tend not to approve changes to the Constitution very much. But certainly I would say that there's an openness or an appetite to reconsidering elements of the Constitution that goes beyond what I think a lot of people would tend to expect.
Well, I think that's just we've got a regional system, and it's up to individuals or groups or whatever within Parliament or lobby groups to get the politicians to give you a referendum on certain things. But as you said, we've had, I think we've had about 40 referendums altogether over time, and I think only about less than 15% of them have got up. They don't often win.
45.
So, in regards to local councils, I'll call them because they're not a level of government. We've had 2 referendums, both under, one was under the Whitlam, I think.
Yep, 74.
One was under Hawke. And one was, I think under Whitlam was to recognise councils as a constitutional level of government, which was soundly defeated. I think New South Wales might have crept over the line in that one. The other one was in Hawke's years, was allowing the Commonwealth to directly fund the councils rather than allocate the money to the states and then it filters down from there. That was also soundly beaten. But I still maintain councils have been elevated to a level well beyond their useful purpose. They're just an administrative arm of the state government, and we notice that, especially in regional Australia, because a lot of the councils in regional and rural Australia, their councils aren't big enough to carry out all the functions you need, even for a council, like planning and other bits and pieces. And what there is there's usually a state government office set up, and a lot of the functionality goes through there. If you go to Cloncurry or something like that, or places like Richmond, and they're only got, I think some of our local council areas are only got 1,000 people in the total area. I mean, it's not enough to support 6 or 7 councillors and a mayor and that, really. But that's the way it is. And the other thing in regional areas, because we've got so few politicians there, I suppose there is this belief or reliance on local councillors to represent them in so many issues, because the nearest politician, even a state one, might be at 500 or 600 miles away. So that's the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. It's. I think there's broadly an important question or discussion to be had around the empowerment of local councils and a rethink of their role within the Federation, especially in filling or plugging a lot of the gaps in the current system. And I think the experience of a lot of regional Australians is that, local councils are expected to pick up a lot of the slack and cover a lot of the things that state and federal governments are missing. But they don't necessarily have the support in terms of resourcing, in terms necessarily of adequate staffing or expertise in order to pick up that slack. And so, I think there's a really compelling case for rethinking how a local level of government works, and what we can do to strengthen local government across the board.
I think basically it's also the fact that we've got very lazy state governments. They've got to a situation where the Commonwealth has basically coerced them into giving over a lot of the powers that the states were responsible for. If you look at education, education is a debacle. It's the standards coming out of it is going down the tubes. Most people would generally say that. And before, if you go back to probably the 70s and even up to the 80s, the states were really in control of their own education system. I came from West Australia. We had our own curriculum. It was funded through the state. The Commonwealth's always contributed, that's fine. But it's got to the situation where now you've got a Department of Education in Canberra that's got about 4,000 people in it. It's got no schools, but it's dictating what the curriculum is and how you're going to run and how you're going to teach. And there's no more competitive federalism in the education system. And that's come about because the Commonwealth collects about 90% of all revenue. And then it uses that power of the revenue to say, well, we'll give you more money for education if you implement this or the NAP plan or whatever. And I think that's where it's sort of gone wrong a bit. That situation where the Commonwealth has such a big portion of the revenue generation, it is sort of crept into areas of this, what was states' responsibility by coercion of, we'll provide you money if you do this. And then what they're trying to do is, if they're trying to sort of pick up these mendicant states like Tasmania and South Australia that basically wouldn't survive economically if they didn't have massive amounts of government jobs and that pumped into them. And they've always sort of basically pull things down to a mediocrity level. Well, that's how I see it. But we did start off federation with the states having control of income tax. Now, that was surrendered during World War II for the greater good of the country. Because this is my just interpretation of what I've read in that, was because things like even rationing went to the 50s, the states didn't sort of ask or demand their powers back straight away. And I think New South Wales was the first one to twig, saying, this has been going on a bit long, maybe we want our powers back. And they went to the High Court, and the High Court said, no, bugger off, this is the way it's going to be. So a lot of the things that have happened with the Constitution as they are now, rather than what our forefathers sort of thought it would be or wrote it up to be, has been changed by the interpretations of the High Court over time as well. It's not just referendums. The High Court's interpretation is also impacted on the operation of our Constitution.
Yes, certainly. And you're right to mark World War II as a real shift in terms of the acceleration of centralism in Australian federalism. But it dates even further before then. You look at the engineers case in 1920 that Chief Justice Griffith, who had a really key role in drafting the Constitution and was our first Chief Justice on the High Court. Some of the really early cases on intergovernmental immunity, so the immunity between of state governments from Commonwealth interference and vice versa. There's a real shift in the really early judgments in the Griffith Court. He then moves on, and then Justice Isaacs leaves the leading judgment in the engineers case in 1920, completely reversing that and really opening the gates for a lot of the centralism that we've seen ever since. And then from World War II, adding a lot of money and
sometimes I think we should have referendums to overturn what the High Court's imposed on us, because I think it's more up to the people to make the decisions than the High Court. So the High Court might come out with a judgment, but I think the population should get a vote on it, where they sort of turn the Constitution on its head. But that's a different matter. But a lot of people look to Griffiths. I mean, he's a Queenslander, and he did play a big role in the Constitution. But he also had another agenda completely. Reading between the lines in the Hansard and a few other things, he made it quite difficult for Queensland to actually come into federation and put up a number of issues, especially giving Central and North Queensland a bit of a whack in regards to, because they were petitioning to separate and become separate colonies at the same time through the 90s. And I think part of his strategy, and I mean, this is just my interpretation, I think his interpretation was he wasn't really that keen about Queensland coming into the Federation. He saw an opportunity that Queensland could become its own country with 3 states. So I don't see Griffiths as so much a hero. I think he was a bit of a villain in some ways in regards to Central and North Queensland, but that's just my view as a person from the regions.
You're welcome to it.
Anyway, moving on to your article in the Townsville Bulletin, which was in response to Matt Canavan's thing. Obviously, prior to Federation, well, initially Australia, or the eastern part of Australia, other than the West Australia, was all New South Wales, and it gradually got broken up into Tasmania becoming a state, South Australia, then Victoria, and then finally Queensland becoming colonies, I should say. So separation it wasn't something spurious, it's something that went on before. But the big difference then was you didn't have to get the Sydney Parliament to approve it. It was a matter of heading off to basically the Colonial Office, then the British Parliament, and then Queen Victoria signing a letter of patent to create a new colony. And that's how it was done before. But with Federation, they obviously realised that it was an issue that new states, should be part of the system for federation. They wrote a whole chapter on it. But as you said, they put in Section 24, and the issue became you had to get over the state parliament. You had to get their blessing to separate. So that is one of the biggest issues, as you point out. Do you think that was intentional, or just it was written at a different time that and people probably didn't expect, with a two-party system, and as we move from statesmen to politicians, to be a bigger blocking influence?
I mean, for me, the more important question is around what is the effect of Section 124 today. Regardless of what the founders' intentions for it were, or what their hopes were for in terms of being able to create new states or separate off different territories and that sort of thing. Really, we're at the point now where I wouldn't go as far as saying that those intentions are irrelevant, but we're operating in such a different political environment that the effect of Section 124 is what it is. And so when we approach questions of new statehood for North Queensland or wherever, it's just a political reality that has to be addressed and confronted. And that's what informs my view around separation of North Queensland, is the really pragmatic good luck getting past Section 124.
Yes, it's definitely a big hurdle. But also the problem is I don't think people foresaw the situation in regards to the major disparity and the growing disparity between our capital cities and regional and rural Australia. I mean, it's just shifted so much. I mean, even up into the 1960s, there was probably more people in the regions and rural areas than there was in the capital cities. And that's just changed over the last five decades or so, to a situation where I think now I think New South Wales has got a population of 8.5 million people, and its state seats. Now, there's only 8 seats west of the Great Divide. And that's the situation we're facing in Central and North Queensland, basically, or regional Queensland in general. It's just population is getting overwhelmed by the population in southeast Queensland, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, and Brisbane. We're sort of losing seats. 2017 redistribution added another 4 seats to southeast Queensland. There's got to be a redistribution again in 2027. there will be an extra 500,000 voters to be allocated across the 93 seats. And as it looks, by looking at the figures, Central and North Queensland will both lose an electorate each. So our representation in the Brisbane Parliament is continually diminishing, and we can, if you look at the projections, moving to a population of 8.5 million like New South Wales, well, that time Central and North Queensland will be lucky if it has 10 seats, and the Parliament will probably have somewhere up in the order of 100, 105 seats. So, you know, we'll only be 10 out of 100 odd seats. That isn't representation. That's not what that's no way to address our needs in that. So to us, the only remedy is separate states. I'll just show you the change. I'll just put up a screen. This is basically the Queensland Parliament. You can see between 1960 and 2023, regional seats have dropped from 44 down to 30, and Southeast Queensland seats have gone up from 34 to 63, and you can see the percentage bounce, and you can also see what's happened with the population, and that's really the problem. And there's no way to address this other than creating new states. That's the only method of arresting diminishing representation.
Is it?
Well, how are you going to get more seats in Central and North Queensland? How are we going to be a bigger portion of the Brisbane Parliament?
Well, I mean, and you know, let me just be very clear that I think that it is important that regional voices in North Queensland and elsewhere are heard and adequately represented in Parliament. So I'm not saying that, you know, you don't deserve representation. Obviously you do, but you see even in that chart that the representation is broadly keeping pace with the proportion of the population. So just as a definitional thing, the representation is proportionate, and that's not to say that there's no representation or that there are concerns in the future around just having enough volume of people in Parliament to be heard. But let's just be right off the bat clear that, you know, there are reasons for those shifts and those changes. But I mean, and again, this is what I come back to is the difficulty of Section 124 and needing state parliament's blessing to create a new state provides such a hurdle that even as the proportion of regional seats in Queensland diminishes, it just gets even harder and harder to create that new state in the first place. So the perspective that I'm coming at this is, it's not a new state is the only option. It's that a new state is practically not going to work. So we need to be creative about thinking about, okay, well, what are the other options? What are the other alternatives? And that can range from, you know, something that is in theory easy to implement, if in practice not working so well, in terms of our current lot of representatives need to do a better job at listening to the concerns of regional Queenslanders, all the way through to extreme reform, but still probably more realistic than creating a new state, which would be something like reintroducing a legislative council or an upper house to Queensland Parliament. You know, that's in the realm of tricky to pull off too, but more realistic, I think, than creating a new state in terms of actually getting it through the political process. And with, you know, with the creation of a legislative council, you could have a model that more adequately protects and preserves regional voices. You could have a mixed member proportionate model that guarantees a number of seats for each region or something like that. So I don't think it's correct to say that there are no options other than creating a new state.
The idea of upper house is it has come up, and Paul Hanson has put it as an option into the states as new states as well. But if you look at the models that are around, there's only really two models. There's one in New South Wales and there's the one in Victoria, and the other states are sort of either one of those two. In New South Wales, it's just the whole state votes for 40. Well, there's 45 members in the upper house in the Legislative Assembly. There's a half assembly election, so 22 go one year and 21 the other year, or something like that, or 23 the other year. Now, the system there, with the fact that our political party system has got to a situation where they're all headquartered in Sydney or Melbourne or whatever, you get the situation where every one of those members in the upper house could live in Sydney, and got no affinity with the people in regional New South Wales or that. So that model was completely flawed. Then you had the other model in Victoria. It still requires, and I doubt if you'd be able to change this, is it still requires, it's divided up into 8 provinces. It's still equal. They try to make equal number of population in each of those 8 provinces. Obviously there's just 4 within the immediate area of Greater Melbourne, but then there's only the northeast region that is completely regionalised. The other regions, actually, the Western region runs right in and connects into the populations of Geelong. The southeast one runs in and actually gets people off the Morning Peninsula to get its numbers up. And there's the northeast, which comes right into sort of the outer suburbs of northeast Melbourne. So you've still got a huge, basically, urban population making deciding who was going to get in those provinces. So it doesn't bode well for fixing the problem. But as you say, there is a problem to get over that section 124. However, it has been done. It was done in New South Wales, and it happens by either a hung parliament where a junior party or a minor party that's formed part of the government, causes the government of the day to give people a referendum. And that's what happened in New South Wales with New England back in 65, and well, from the late 40s on, the New England movement was reconstituted. It had hundreds of town meetings. I think it had about 140 local papers on its side. A guy called Victor Thompson, journalist. There wouldn't have been one regional paper that wasn't supporting us as the idea of a separate New England state. And that movement also had an influence on the then Country Party. And so by the time they went to the 65 election, it was I think Charles Cutler was the leader of the then Country Party, and he basically did a deal with Askin that if they won the 65 election, they would give the coalition government would give the people of New England a referendum. They won the election. Big problem. Only won it by 2 seats. So if the referendum had been successful, well, the first thing that would happen, about 10 or 12 Country Party seats would have went into the new states, and the Liberals, what was left in New South Wales, would have been back in the wilderness sort of thing. So not something they really wanted to happen. So if we maybe have a look at that sort of exercise, I'll just chuck up a screen. So we had, that's the New England flag, of course, the movement. Now, it wasn't exactly unusual back in the early days of federation for states, especially New South Wales. It had a couple of royal commissions. It had a royal commission in the 20s. I think it was the Cohen Royal Commission, and they actually went out and looked at suitable regions for and came up with a couple of options. And then they moved into the situation in the 30s where there was a Nicholas Royal Commission. And what it did, it actually looks at the criteria for a new state and its and things like its borders. They came out with recommendations like the border should go through sparsely populated areas. So it should never divide a community or a highly populated area. It shouldn't be a river shouldn't be used as a border either. So it wasn't unusual for them to actually be considering separate states, but that was a time when before we really got into our two major party systems. So we went to the sort of border, the New England state movement sort of had. It didn't include Newcastle. It was sort of right off there or somewhere near Taree. They would have won the election. So they had the referendum. It was lost 168,000 votes to 198,000 votes. So it was reasonable, but here was the trick. The areas around Newcastle were put into the boundaries of the new state, right down to Lake Macquarie. And I think Lake Macquarie is only about 100 and the bottom of it's only about 140 kilometres or something to Sydney. So, and the people of Lake Macquarie and Newcastle and those areas had no affinity with the people in New England and the rural areas. So it was the poor performance in those ballot boxes that lost them that referendum. So that's the interesting thing. There's probably two things that come out of it. Whoever's running a campaign for a separate state want to be very sure about the borders and that they're going to win the ballot boxes. The other thing is, don't trust someone in regards to them giving you a referendum unless you're defining the boundaries.
Yeah, well, and the key lesson being they came close, but it's still just one big state of New South Wales. It didn't go ahead, and that was 100 years ago when
No, that was only 50 odd years ago.
67. I was thinking of the charts in 1923. So yeah, referendum itself much more recent, but the thinking long predating it. But even since 67, the dynamics of the federation have changed, I think, so much that it just is such a high bar to clear that, and I will not say never. I think if you were in 1921, would you say that Queensland legislative councillors would vote themselves out of a job? It seems insane, and yet it happened. So never say never, but it's just such a high bar to clear that, to me, I think the energy of how can we ensure that regional voices are heard and how can we ensure or better represent the interests and needs of regional Queenslanders and regional Australians, all that energy and enthusiasm, I think, is better channeled towards other measures than can we create a new state?
Well, the problem is with Central and North Queensland, there's 19 seats. The bulk of them held by the ALP, and it's been held by the ALP throughout most of the history. They're not interested in separate states of that. And they're certainly not interested in representing the people here or our interests. You constantly, the legislation.
So that's the point, right? It's
but
not.
they're overwhelmed by the numbers from southeast Queensland. So they might go to the party room and bang on the desk, but when it comes to what policy comes out of that party room, they're going to be based on that. You can look at things like water policies and agriculture. If you can give me an example of one piece of legislation that's come out of the federal parliament or the state parliament in the last 10 years that have been beneficial to regional communities and industries, let us know, because the changes in Vegetation Management Acts, the restrictions on water, the protection of the Great Barrier Reef, and its impact on farmers, and that has been horrendous. Attitude towards mining is always negative. It's just constant warfare against people in regional Australia. We're not going to get any way forward with the representation that we've got, even if they're good members of parliament. When they go down there, they're just completely overwhelmed in the party room.
Okay, and I think that's the point, is that clearly the status quo is not working. I think we agree on that. And it's a question of, okay, well, what is the problem and what are the potential solutions to that problem? New statehood being one of the potential solutions to that problem, but politically and constitutionally a very difficult solution. So what are the other solutions is where my mind goes to.
Well, I would suggest you come and live in central North Queensland, live in an electorate, and see if you can get your member of parliament to fix up things like crime up here, water issues, funding, roads. Good luck to you, because they just don't have a voice in Brisbane.
Yeah, they don't. I agree with that, and that's why I'm saying.
Look at it. You look at Northern Australia. It's got 80% of Australia's mainland rainfall, and the idiots out of Brisbane, they did a review on the Bradfield scheme. Not that I'm overly favourable for that, but if you go and read about page 93 of that report, it basically gives you things like the output flow of the river has to be maintained somewhere between 94 and 90% of the flow rate volume. So that means you can only ever take, for irrigation, drinking water, in new developments, between 3 and 7% of the water out of those rivers. These rivers up here, when we have the monsoons and the wet season, they flow at such a great rate. They just send water, racking out to the Gulf of Carpentaria or in the Coral Sea, and we're only allowed to take 3 to 7% out of those things. You're going to be joking, but that's what they're setting for us. So we cannot develop. You had legislation coming out for the fishermen in putting on very low quotas for mackerel, barramundi, and the gill nets. There is just no legislation that's doing us a favour in regional Queensland.
Okay, so, and I think we agree on that. You're giving me these good examples of instances where representation for regional Queenslanders has not been sufficient or has not been successful in convincing the dominant Southeast Queensland bloc to take into consideration the needs of Northern Queensland, right? And yet we think that they will be able to convince, those same people will be able to convince the people in Brisbane that they should be allowed to split off into their own state. That's the difficulty that I have, is the problems that create the need for a North Queensland state are also the problems that make it very difficult to achieve that.
The normal situation, but even with the going back to one going back to one value system after 89 and after the Fitzgerald inquiry. Now, other than landslide victories, you only need between 7 and 8 people on the crossbench who are orientated to a separate state. So if you look at the parliament, we'll continue in this next parliament after this election. We'll still have 93 seats. Now, it's reasonable to expect that the incumbents, the ALP, will lose some seats because their performance over time. Hopefully that Liberal Party can pick up a number of seats, but they've still got to get somewhere between 10 and 12 seats. Just I think actually they've got to get to about 14 seats to get to a majority situation where have majority governments from where they stand now. So other than we may again see a Newman type situation, but if we get back into the normal bounce of things, you know, within one party or the other parties within three or four seats of each other, 7 seats held by North Queensland members is going to give them the bounce of power. And if they're all in favour of a separate North Queensland state, they can basically hold the parliament to a situation where, we won't pass any, we will guarantee supply, but we're not going to let you pass any legislation for the next 4 years unless you give us a referendum. So yes, that's the coercion that we've got to have. But we've got the situation now. We've got with the One Nation, Steve Andrews going over to the Katters Party. Katters have now got four seats in the parliament. They're pro North Queensland state. They're exactly what their vision of a North Queensland state is a bit obscure, and it's certainly different to mine. But they only need to pick up 3 seats, and in this environment where neither of the major parties are the flavour of the thing, there is a possibility of a hung parliament, and that is the hope of getting this over the line, that a minority government is forced into the situation that it has to give the people of Central and North Queensland an opportunity to have that referendum. And basically, I find it difficult for how can people justify it? Now, aren't the million people of Central and North Queensland at least entitled to the same political representation of the 500,000 odd in Tasmania? That's basically, where we're coming from is, it's all well and good to have Tasmania, a mendicant state. Then you've got Central and North Queensland with 1 million people in it. It actually produces 80% of all your exports wealth for Queensland. We're not short of a bob. People make this thing out, you're not viable that. But that comes in on the perception that a lot of people think we're talking about just North Queensland as a separate state. There's only, if you look at North Queensland, Central is North Queensland and far North Queensland. It's got about 500 and something thousand in it, people. It's economically, it's fair, but it's not really well off. It's Central Queensland that's got the wealth. But if you pick up this sort of situation, if you look at Northern Queensland as recognised by the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility, this is the area you're talking about. You've got 1 million people. You've got over 80% of all Queensland's exports coming out of there. Something to the tune of I think just coal and agriculture probably pumped out something like $90 billion in the last year or so. We're not short of a quid. And the other thing is, if we had a separate state, you wouldn't have all these headquarters of the cane growers, banana growers sitting in Sydney and in Brisbane, earning $300,000 annually for each person down there in the headquarters, from the toil of the people in Central and North Queensland. Those sort of peak bodies would have to be relocated into this area, and also the public servants that are down in here, well, they'd be up, or there'd be more up here, and they'd be spending their money in central and North Queensland. So I suppose that's the big difference, where the perception of what people think North Queensland is versus what a northern Queensland state is.
Yeah, I think a lot of it turns on where you draw the line and what's included and what's not. And you know, even to go back to your example from New South Wales earlier, in terms of, you know, whether Newcastle gets included or not, right? The politics of where you draw the line matters a lot in terms of, you know, what could this look like, and how might it work. And yeah, I don't disagree that northern regional Queenslanders deserve adequate representation. It's just the pragmatics of how to deliver that are very complex.
Like I say, it really needs a minority government where the people, you know, in the minority supports the proposition. And actually, we could have had that referendum happened in 2016, except the people in the room didn't, you know, they were either not thinking, or, you know, their vision what a North Queensland looked like, they weren't that confident themselves. But there actually was a working group put together in 2016, basically was brought upon, but that was a hung parliament. But what happened was, with the, I think it was an independent former Liberal guy became the speaker, and what had happened is the two CATA members, the government needed them to get legislation through, but it didn't stop them from operating as a government. But what the CATAs and that did was create this working group, and there was a meeting in Townsville. I think there was George Christensen was there, some people from industry, I think Jeff Cox, Peter Raffles, a couple of LNP people. Anyway, there was about 10 in the working group. And by that time, Billy Gordon had been booted out of, well, he resigned from the ALP and was sitting as independent. And also the member for Cairns, I can't remember his name just at the moment, but he also resigned. But he resigned over some corruption, you know, bringing up matters of corruption down in Toowoomba or somewhere like that. And they were actually, he was actually in the room. So he could have made up the third member of Parliament between the Robbie Katter, Shane Knuth, and him, could have forced the Queensland government into a situation. Well, now there's three of us sitting on the crossbench, and if we go and talk to Billy Gordon, who represents Cook, you know, which is the end of the Cape of York area as well, the four of them got together. They could have, you know, they could have coerced the state government into giving them a referendum. But I don't know where they were at that point in time with their thinking. But they missed that opportunity. So, but we do. It's only a matter if we go to have a normal election and not get into a situation of a Newman landslide. 7 seats on the crossbench, people from Central and North Queensland. We'll certainly be putting some pressure on them to sort of, well, push the issue to get us a referendum. And I don't see why people would be so against letting us have the opportunity to vote on it. It's not saying that we'll get across the line. You still got to win the referendum. But why wouldn't you allow a million of your fellow Queenslanders the opportunity to make that decision for themselves?
Yeah. I think the difficult thing is that it's still under Section 124, it's still a vote of the state parliament, so they wouldn't necessarily be bound by a referendum result. And obviously, you would hope that if
I think if they try to not go along with the actual outcome of a referendum, I think they might be putting themselves into a bit of spot of bother. I think people would have a lot of angst if they ever got across the line in a referendum and they decide, oh no, we're just going to ignore the million people in central and north Queensland. You think that's going to get our back up a little bit?
Oh yeah, well, and that's what I was about to say is, you would hope that the result would be respected. But yeah, it's not a straightforward thing. And
no, there's, like you say, there's a hurdle. We need a hung parliament. We need enough members to push it so it forces the government into the issue. And also we get a referendum question that is going to win. I think, I mean, we've had this discussion in the past, and it was, I think, just going back to the 2000 and more in the 2017 state election, more than the 20, because the 20 was a bit of a weird one because we had COVID and there was a lot of other concerns people were looking, but there was a bit of activity for separate states then. It was sort of on the horizon, but the thing is, what happens is the ALP continually just rolls out its spokespeople, or the people who support their position. And in case of economics and separate state, they usually pull out Paul Williams, roll him out, and he says, "Oh, it's uneconomically unviable. On a capita basis, regions gets more money than the people in southeast Queensland." That's fine, but the problem is everyone knows what the scales of economy are and things like that. And then if you look at how the Grants Commission allocates money, they actually allocate money to the Queensland state government to take care of remote communities and things. The Grants Commission gives Queensland at least an extra $1 billion of grant money to pay for some of the costs of providing services in regional and remote Queensland. So if there was a Northern Queensland state, well, that money would just go from the Commonwealth to Northern Queensland to administer. So there are sort of things. The other thing is, it's always been, the biggest problem is, and I think Bob Catter is probably one of the big problems. He keeps referring to North Queensland. He sort of suggests, it's somewhere, the border somewhere down near Serena, south of Mackay. Well, no, that's just that's not giving you enough population, and it allows people like Paul Williams to sort of economically knock it out the park. But to disarm that, if you had the border that's recognised as Northern Queensland by the Queensland Treasury and the Commonwealth under the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund Act, well, that's a completely different situation. Now you've got 1 million people, you've got the bulk of the coal industry, and like I said, you've got basically 80% of the state gross product from the area. So the economic things, you completely disarm the argument of people like Paul Williams. So when you go to the referendum, you've got a much better chance of making your case than you did with a vague border somewhere around south of Mackay or something like that.
Yeah, well, so there's two things that leap out to me there. The first being I'm not an economist, so the question of economic viability is one that I'm not super clear on, but I do know that it matters a lot where that line is drawn. But also politically, we've seen, just from obviously very different topic, but we've seen from the Voice referendum last year that anything that's going to be put to the people for a vote needs to have a lot of specificity and concrete details ironed out in order for people to have confidence that they could support it. So, you know, if it all kind of went ahead, yeah, I agree that it would need to be very clear and very well ironed out. And that is part of, there's the huge political problem, but then there's also that difficulty of, I suppose, the fracturing within the new state movement about those questions of where is the line drawn, what's included.
Well, I think that
issues too.
you're right. I think that's one of the issues. The people who are advocating for a separate northern Queensland state, or the people advocating for a North Queensland state, need to sort of have a bit of a think and talk to people who look at a more broader northern Queensland state to ensure that it's a viable state from the start. It completely disarms the economic argument. Guarantee one of the important things is what we need to do is have the population base to guarantee getting at least 4.5 quotas to 5 quotas to guarantee 5 seats in the House of Reps. If you can ensure you get 5 seats in the House of Reps, you've got a much better chance of getting a full allocation of senators, because again, I think it's section 121 says that the Parliament will make a decision in regards to the political representation of the new state. That's in part true, but it's not true in regards to the lower house. The only thing that decides how many seats you're going to have in the lower house is how many population quotas you have. It's basically the new state's population divided by it was 144, I think. That's the Australian population. That's mainland states. Australian population divided by 144 or something like that, and you get, I think at the moment you get 185,000 people, residents, and that will give you one population quota. So you'll get 1 seat. So basically, a new state to get 5 seats, you need to get up around about 850,000 people resident in it to guarantee you that five federal seats. Then you can, when you go to get the Senate allocation, I think the government will be hard pressed not to give you a full allocation of senators, whether it's 12 or, you know, keeping the Senate and the House of Representatives in a 2-to-1 ratio. What should happen if we got a 7th state, the number of senators in each state should drop down to 10, basically. Or if they're kept at 12, the House of Representatives would have to take on another 24 seats. And let's face it, the Parliament needs to be increased, because I don't think we've had an increase in the federal Parliament since '86. So I think back in those days, when if you looked at a seat and you looked at the voting tally, they probably had somewhere about 70,000 voters in it that dropped the ballot in. And these days you've got seats that have got 121,000. So I think some members in the federal Parliament are making noises that, just as a matter of course, because of the growing population, because we've gone up from, I think that we're about about 12.5 million people then. We've now doubled that population. So of course there's a bit of a chatter about, well, maybe it's time we had some more seats in Parliament to drop the numbers in each seat. So they're the sort of things we're faced with.
Well, and on top of that, there's the issue, you know, a couple of times in our discussion this evening, we've come up against this problem of partisanship and the two-party system. And so part of the difficulty is, even if the new state is established, obviously on state level issues, there's a lot more control and autonomy. But at the federal level, there's very few guarantees that that new state membership comes with a whole lot more representation at the federal level compared to what's currently done. You know, maybe you get a situation, especially in the Senate, where, you know, you get very strong advocates. You know, Tasmania has quite the history of it, and that plays a role. But, you know, in the lower house especially, even if there is the new state, there's no guarantee that that comes with better representation in federal parliament.
No, because they could just belong to the major parties, and we've got the
Exactly.
same problem. But it
Exactly.
is the Senate that's is the key. I would think if there was a new state, I think there would be a general interest in regards to getting, picking people who are actually going to be representing the state interest rather than the party interest. So I think, maybe there would be a party that's just, North Queensland Party, Northern Queensland Party, or something like that, putting up their senators or whatever, to sort of do that. But one of the big changes that happens with the Senate, which is, if you look down at the breakdown of the 19 state seats that would make up a Northern Queensland state, if you look at the voting patterns, if you look at the 2020 election, I think there was 580,000 votes cast. There was only 27,000 for the Greens. So what would happen is, alternately from the situation you've got now, where every state's got 2 Green senators, right? You would, Northern Queensland state, on the basis of the way the breakup of the polling was in 2020, you would have no senators from the Greens, right? So that would be the start of a change of makeup in the Senate, because the bane of regional Queensland is the federal Senate. If we're going to be attacked, or legislation is going to come out to take our water, ping us for over in the environment, it's going to come out of the Senate. There's 18 crossbenchers now. 12 of them are the Greens. You got Pocock, who couldn't, he's extreme green. He's awful, taking every bit of water out of the Murray-Darling basins and let it go out the Murray River mouth, sort of thing. So you've got those sort of extremities. One of the biggest advantages of 1, 2, or 3 new regional states, it would completely change the makeup in the Senate. It would change the outlook in regards to the influence of the Greens and the radical people who want to shut down things like live sheep trade, block mining at everything, restrict our water use. So I think there's big pluses for more states, especially in the Senate, in changing that aspect where you've got these really city-focused, ideological people in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane with their real anti-regional agenda. That's probably the only way we're going to tone them down a bit.
I mean, I'm hesitant to get too much into the politics of that. But I mean, I haven't done the numbers on where the votes are coming from, but arguably, sure, you lose, a Green senator and maybe a couple of ALP from the northern areas, but then you probably get a few more in the southern, whatever the sort of the Queensland state, the south becomes. They just pop back up in greater proportion there. So I don't know that that's necessarily, it's very far down a hypothetical rabbit hole to really engage with.
Well, one of the other things that happens too, if you had an extra state and they maintain the Senate as the parliament the size it is, with only 10 senators, the quota to win a seat is going to be higher. It makes it more difficult for minor parties to get a Guernsey. So there's that factor plays into it. But as far as I'm concerned, the Senate in the federal parliament, where new states are going to make a difference is going to be in the Senate, not in the House of Representatives, because again, it's only based on your population. You'll only get the same numbers, whatever federal seats you've got in your current area of what your current state is. That's the population you've got. That's the number of seats you're going to get in the lower house. Federal Senate, it does give you an opportunity to get an advantage. But like I say, Section 124, it's a hurdle for us to get over, but it's been done before, and we need to keep our eye on that. But
It's
as
been
we move
attempted
forward,
before, but it hasn't been done
just as
before.
we start, no, we got to the referendum. That's all I'm saying. Or at least give us the opportunity of a referendum and make it a border that we decide, not sneaking in areas that go to vote, 15% in their ballot box like they did in New South Wales. I mean, if they had just drawn a line at 32 degrees south, just south of Taree, that state would have got up by about 70% to 30%. The fact that you went down into that Maitland, Newcastle, and Lake Macquarie area, that made the difference. So that's one thing. Whoever's pushing a separate state, they need to have those sort of things and agreed on with all the different advocacy groups. Because there are a number of advocacy groups in North Queensland and people advocating for North East Queensland state, they have to get the same picture out there for everyone. But just moving on to something different. In regards to the work going forward with this committee is ongoing. It's sort of saying that it meets every couple of years. So do they have an agenda for what's going to be? I just noticed there someone said it was Rob Pine was the other member of Parliament, LNP person from the Cairns seat who resigned from the ALP back in 2016. So that gave four people the opportunity to force the minority ALP government into the situation to give a referendum. But is there agenda out every couple of years? Like, have you got points to discuss when you go to the next one, or is that set out, and who sets that?
Sorry, I think I missed. You sort of broke up a little bit.
Where the survey work in regards to the. Oh, what I was talking about then was just that the fourth person who left, the other person who left the ALP back in 2016 was Rob Pine, and he was actually in the room with that working group. He was actually part of the working group. But just moving to your focus now, that you're focused on, these survey groups, you're sort of suggesting that they happen every couple of years. Is there agenda out for the next one and points of discussion, or what you got to survey and feedback from the previous survey?
Yeah, so we're currently working on the next iteration of the survey. It might go out later this year, if not very early next year. The key, we've got a broader project, and I think you mentioned in the bio in the start, looking at public trust and distrust and mistrust. So sort of thinking about these ideas of, healthy skepticism, which should be celebrated and valued in a democracy. We don't just want blind trust and faith all the time. But equally, we don't necessarily want things spilling over into blind distrust or we want people to sort of have take things with a grain of salt.
Completely opposite view for no good reason.
Judge things on their merits. And so the project and the next batch of surveys are really going to be focused on, okay, well, what are the things that are driving these different parts of the trust family, and what can be done by governments, but also by other actors within the community to help create a more, I suppose, fruitful democracy, where we get all these benefits of robust discussion and healthy skepticism to create better government decision making without it spilling over into automatically everything the government does is terrible. Sometimes they do good things, maybe not as often as we would like, but sometimes they do good things, and we want to be able to be open to recognizing that as well, just as we want to be able to catch when they do the wrong thing?
Well, I think the politicians haven't helped themselves in the last 20 years or so.
No, I don't think they have either.
They don't actually don't speak the truth all the time. This they always go to election. Well, we've got to be transparent in that, and those same governments turn out to be have great big secret things, and we'll never discuss it. If you look at the Victorian government, there's so much documentation locked up over COVID. Same with us, that we're never going to see. I mean, we don't see any transparency in regards to their pathway to treaty. We just get this sudden hit that they're going to hand over this bunch of land over here. There's no discussion of it. Their consultation process, well, it doesn't exist. They decide someone in environmental amendments and things like that in legislation. You can go back into the 2015s of that. You can go and look at the Australian Conservation Society and the Marine Conservation Society and read some of their stuff that they had on their website, what they wanted. Well, guess what? That formed the things that were in there formed the basis of legislation that came out for the reef and also the Vegetation Management Act. That was straight from their handbook. You've got situations where the guy, Nick Heath, who was actually the chairman of World Wildlife Fund Australia and also Australian Conservation, he became the chief of staff of the Minister of Environment. People in the regions can't get a fair go if that's how you're going to pad up your environmental department, and then your consultation is, we go around, like the Vegetation Management Act, they had about 20 or 30 town meetings, right up to Mount Isa and things like that. They had 712 submissions. Not one word in that act was changed, regardless of all the input to object into it and counter information. So that's one of the big problems is, at least if you're going to say you've got to have consultation, at least have proper consultation, make sure it's done properly, make sure it takes into account, and also actually implement some of the skepticism or the other changes you need. Otherwise, just do what you're really doing is just come out and don't bother going to see anyone. Just post the legislation out and hit people over the head with it. But do you think they're sort of things that we really need to sort of more address? Because although they say there's consultation and transparency, but it doesn't seem to be there.
I mean, the thing, and I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to take up your whole evening.
Yeah.
Go all night on this.
We'll finish up.
But it's interesting that in that answer, when you look at the trust literature, one of the dominant kind of models of trust is that it has three dimensions: competence, integrity, and benevolence. So, do you trust them to be able to do their job properly? Do you trust them to be honest and transparent and accountable? And do you trust that they're in it for the right reasons, i.e. to look after the interests of citizens, not to line their own pockets? And, you need all three firing in order to have trust in something. Where there are problems, obviously trust is going to be impacted. I don't think that anyone really needs to be told that. We all kind of know that intuitively. But one of the main things that we're looking at in the project is, okay, well, how can we look at kind of the guardrail institutions, kind of the mechanisms both within the legal system and adjacent to it, to help keep politicians and other political actors honest, so that hopefully they become more trustworthy. And when there are issues with that, how do they get addressed without poisoning the whole well of wider public trust? But that in itself it's a complex issue, which is why we're looking at it.
How many people are sort of on the sort of committee or group, and sort of what's the highest ranking sort of person amongst the group?
As in within the research team?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's 5 of us listed on the project. It's led by Professor AJ Brown, who I
Yeah,
mentioned before, and who's been on your project. And then we've got, yeah, another researcher over at Griffith, one at University of Sydney and one at La Trobe. So yeah, it's a good team, and across all of them a lot of experience in research in law, political science, media, and communication. It's a great team, and it's a great project to be a part of.
well, I wish you all luck in regards to restoring some or getting the politicians to adopt principles and that so it restores some public trust. I think you've got a lot of work there.
I think we do
But
too.
look, I'd like to really thank you for your time tonight. Really appreciate it. Would you just like to wind up on any point in particular about your work going forward?
Oh, not especially. Just yeah, thank you very much for having me on. I think we agree on more points than maybe came across.
Methodology is the issue.
It's well, yeah, I think it's the we want to address the same problem in terms of how do you ensure regional voices are heard. I think we just have different ideas around the practicality of how you make that happen. And it's important that we're able to have these discussions in order to ultimately get the problem solved. That's the objective. And so yeah, it's been good to have this chat, and all the best with getting a hung parliament.
Okay. Okay, Jake, look, thanks very much for the time. If you just hold on for a second, I'll just introduce next week's guest.
Okay, no
If
worries.
you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Our guest next week will be Keith Hamburger. Now, Keith was the Commissioner for Corrective Services. He is now been leading a campaign in regards to justice reform, and especially in regards to juveniles. And we'll be discussing going forward with the justice system in our next interview. So join me next Wednesday when my guest will be Keith Hamburger. Thanks very much.